welcome. Proposal writing workshop. And this is going to be a good overview of proposal writing for everyone who's joined. I'm Dave Holmes from Candid. Candid is an organization that started back in February 2019. We've been around as Foundation Center and as GuideStar, two separate organizations. Foundation Centers have been around for over 60 years and GuideStar for over 35. And in 2019, when we joined forces, we collected all the information together that we have been gathering for years about philanthropy and grants and information about nonprofits and their transparency and their details. So together, we're here to be candid about all of the information that we have. And so we try to find out where millions of nonprofits get their money and how they get it, where it goes, and why it matters. So what we've been doing lately is the same things we've always done, which is continuing our training. We moved from in-person to virtual in March of this year, and we're continuing with lots of trainings, free trainings, fee-based trainings, all different ones on grant writing, on putting your profile on GuideStar, on fundraising planning, and all the different things that we do. We still collaborate with lots of different organizations, including the Toledo Lucas County Public Library, and we're glad to have them as a partner in the efforts that we do. And we continue to do research on what's going on in the world of nonprofits and the world of philanthropy. We have something I'm very proud of. We have a Candid learning site which gives you information on the things you need to know in this current situation. But two new websites that we are very happy to share with you. One is specifically about the COVID-19 crisis, and it's COVID-19 resources. It's a collection not just of information on what's going on with nonprofits and philanthropy in that world, but with grant opportunities and requests for proposals for grants related to COVID issues and COVID efforts. And it's a searchable database that's free for use, and you can find information about resources in your area, about short-term funding opportunities, about who's giving and where they've given, and also recordings of trainings that really help you understand how COVID has been affected nonprofits like your own. So I encourage you to take a look at that. I also encourage you to take a look at our racial equity resources page, which is a new page that tracks racial equity grant making from foundations and other organizations to nonprofits, really responding to the George Floyd issues and some of the things that we've been discussing recently, and with a lot of helpful information, links to recordings of trainings and blogs that will help you out in working with racial equity in your organization. So take a look at any of those. If you want to know about anything that we do, you can always sign up for our newsletter. And the link for the newsletter, Ken has been putting some of these links in your chat. So keep an eye on the chat so that you can get that kind of information. All right. I'm glad to see you here. And yes, we are recording today's presentation. So Zach will make sure that everybody gets a link to this resource. But the first thing I want to do is take advantage of the fact that you're all here. And I see that we have about 30 people, almost 30 people in the room. What I'm going to do is break you out into breakout rooms. And if you've never done this before, it's pretty simple. We'll see something on your screen that pops up and says, join this room, and you can join it. And then what I'm going to ask you to do for 5 or 10 minutes is to just introduce yourself to the other people that are in the room. And also discuss what a funder might value most when learning about a nonprofit. And you can make it about your nonprofit. What's the thing that you want to share the most with a potential funder? I'm going to use this as kind of preparation for what we're going to talk about in the rest of the program. So I'm going to open up the breakout rooms, and I'm going to create a bunch of them here. So there should be 2 or 3 people in each of the breakout rooms. If you find yourself alone or you haven't been able to join the breakout room, we'll still be in the main room so that you can ask us questions or come back here. So I'm going to give you guys about 5 to 10 minutes. I'll give you a 1-minute warning before we come back. So here we go. All right, well, welcome back. And I hope you guys got a chance to introduce yourselves and to talk a little amongst yourselves. And I know people are shy and you don't want to unmute or anything like that, but if you wouldn't mind sharing in the breakout room, what is the thing that a funder values most when they want to learn about a nonprofit organization? If you were going to tell a funder something, Amy says it's okay to be Zach, by the way. If you want to tell somebody something about your organization, what do you want to tell them? Tanya, did you have something you wanted to share?
Yeah, Dave, I wanted to say that it is important to share your vision and your mission. Those are the two things that I think will get someone interested in wanting to work with you with being a funder.
Absolutely.
So
Absolutely.
those
That's
are two things that I can think of.
Those are the things that you would lead with. Absolutely. That would make a funder excited about knowing. What else? If you were a funder, what would you want to know? It doesn't have to be Tanya. Anybody else who can answer that? Your funder, what would you want to know about your nonprofit to decide whether or not to fund it?
My name's Skylar. I think what you want to know also is how will the funds not only be spent, and put to good use within the context of your funding requirements, but what plans would you have for sustainability after the fact?
Absolutely. Those are two really great things. So we're going to give you this money. We're going to be investing in you. We want to know exactly what's going to happen to that money and who's going to benefit. And then also, how are you going to keep going if we stop funding you or after this year, or in addition to us, who else is going to be funding you? Those things are incredibly important. Two, when you think about it, these are people that are giving you money because they want to invest in you. So you want to give them reason to invest. You want to show yourself to be a good investment. That's absolutely true. Thank you. Anybody else want to share something that's vital, something that's very important?
Oh, when Matthew and I were talking, one of the things that we discussed was the fact that it's good to have a compelling story. I found when I've written grants in the past, one of the things that our funders like is that there's a good story to tell about your organization or about a group that you're bringing into your organization and you're looking for funding for that group.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. The story that you are telling, and that's really, I think, the key to writing a grant proposal and making a convincing case for why somebody should invest in you, is that story. Show me what my gift is going to do for the people that we care most about. Tell me the story that gets my attention and that grabs me and makes me want to invest in you. I worked as a program officer for a foundation for several years. I've been a nonprofit and grant writer for working for nonprofits and being a grant writer for many years. And I know that that's the thing that I always look for, is the thing that I can remember, that I can hook onto, that I can care about. And that's the story. So that's really the most important thing. If you remember nothing else from this training, remember that story is really what a funder hooks onto and uses to get to the other information. Thank you so much, everybody, for sharing what you've shared. And please do continue to ask questions and share things through chat. I'll pause it a number of times so that we can ask questions and we can get your questions answered. But thank you so much for joining today. So at the end of this training, I'm just going to go over some of the basics for this. At the end of this training, you should be able to understand the basic elements of a proposal, and you should have a clear idea of what you need to do to put one together. And even if you've done it before in the past, you should have a better sense of what's necessary. We are going to teach you what you can use to draft a proposal, and we're not going to ask you to sit down and write. Even though it is a 3-hour program, you don't really have time to write a full proposal in this situation. But I do want to give you some time to do some activities and put parts of a grant proposal together that you can use. And we have some worksheets and resources that you can use to do that. So we'll make sure we talk about that. I am also going to talk about approaching foundations and making sure that you can get funded from the people that you approach. There's a lot about grant writing that isn't just grant writing. It's about relationship building, building a relationship with a potential funder, asking them about their organization, making sure you connect to them, and making sure that the fit is clear to whoever reads your grant proposal. And then also that relationship building is what you do at the beginning, it's what you do afterwards so that you can continue to have a relationship with a potential funder. And I'm going to make sure we go through all of those different things. Please do send in questions, as I said, anytime that you have it as we go through. I'm going to start by talking about the proposal writing process. And it really comes in a number of different steps. And the first, most important step is planning. You don't want to try and get a grant without having a clear sense of what it is that you are looking for funding for. If you haven't met with your board of directors and discussed the top priorities, if you don't have a clear plan for the year, you don't have to have a written out to this second fundraising plan, but you should be clear about what is the most important thing that you can fundraise for related to grants. Grants aren't great for paying for everything. A lot of the times it's difficult to get a grant for general operating, for just anything that you do. Grants are not the best way to get quick funding and emergency funding. And in fact, in the COVID situation, that's the reason why there are so many new COVID funds, is that the regular grant process just doesn't allow for this kind of emergency situation. So if you are in an emergency situation at your organization, you really should think about approaching the foundation or the different funder through a COVID fund that they might have. And a lot of foundations, particularly community foundations, have set up specific COVID funds at this time. You have to be very clear about where you are. And I'm going to be mentioning a number of things related to COVID at this time because everybody is dealing with it. And we are going to be dealing with it most likely in the near and foreseeable future. One other thing that you should do when you think about planning is think about how COVID and your situation has changed in your organization. What is different now? Are you delivering your services differently? I'm delivering services virtually. I would normally be doing this. I would drive out to Toledo. I would stand up in front of all of you and teach this class, and I would be able to tell whether you're paying attention or whether you have your camera off. You got a luxury here that you can't tell. I can't pick on you or anything like that in the class. It's different the way that I deliver this training, and it's different because I can't rely on being able to see you and being able to tell what you're thinking and what you're doing. I know that your organizations are all different. Some of you can't do things in person that you used to do. Some of the things that you do have to change because you need to add additional time to clean things. You need to add additional ability to put up something in your offices so that people don't get infected if they come in. That is important to make clear to any funder that you reach out to, because one of the questions they're going to have, regardless of whether this is emergency funding or not, is how has COVID made a difference in how you deliver, and how might your programs change, or have they changed already in the next year? So being clear about what you're looking for funding for, what you intend to write for grants is vital before you start researching, before you start trying to find out who is the best funder to give there. And I'll talk a little bit more about this. We have a tool called the Foundation Directory Online, which I hope a lot of you have used. It's a tool that we make freely available through our partners, including the Toledo Lucas County Public Library. That's vital for going to the right funders. You can't just assume that every funder is going to be the right one. And writing follows from this. So once you have a clear plan in mind and you've researched and found funders, you may have outlined what you're going to do beforehand, but the writing should be something that you customize based on these funders. Some of them are going to have an online application that's going to have a number of different short fields to fill in, and that, it has to be 150 characters or 200 words or something like that. That writing changes depending on what you're doing. Your program doesn't change, but how you write, what you send into the funder also changes. And at the same time, you think about what you're saying in a way that helps edit it down. I put writing and editing because editing is equally important. You have to shorten a lot of the times what you're going to say. I often have a master proposal, a main grant proposal that I use that I modify for a program that I'm trying to fund. And sometimes I make it shorter paragraphs. Sometimes I take one part and focus on that, but I always have it working from like this main document that I'm going to work for. Editing down and focusing on what's most important and making sure it's clear, making sure it's not just all run together, that there's bullet points and white space and everything that's difficult to understand is spelled out. That is part of the writing process, and I'll talk more about that as we go on. Formatting, I already mentioned. Grant makers are moving more towards online formats, especially lately. That doesn't mean that those formats are all the same. It would be nice if they were, but they're not. They do tend to ask the same things, but they don't always use the same words to ask for them, and they don't always have the same amount of space in them. So you have to be prepared to reformat what you're doing. This is an outline of a typical grant proposal. And I'm going to be talking about each part of it as we go on this afternoon. I'm going to be talking about writing the executive summary, but I'm not going to talk about that first because the executive summary is what you write last. When you're writing a grant proposal, the most important parts are the narrative and the budget. The narrative, and we've already heard this, the story that you're telling, that is key. That is the most important part, telling what's going to happen. And I'm going to talk about each part of it as we go through and give you a chance to work on some of the parts yourself. The project description, the statement of need, the organizational information, and the conclusion. That's the story that we were talking about, that you're telling a funder. How you made something different or how you plan to make something different to people who are in need. That's the story. The budget is a numerical representation of everything in that story. So I'm sure you've heard this before, that oftentimes foundations will look at a grant proposal and they will, that will be the one part of what they look at, but they often turn to the budget before they look at anything else. They often read through the budget to get a good sense of how the money is to be spent in this project. And if you've looked at 100 different grant proposals, I work for a very small foundation, and we had about 100 grant proposals every 3 months to review. You look at a lot of them, you begin to see the structure. You see what's a reasonable way to put personnel together and what's a reasonable cost for different things. It tells you a story also. It tells you a story that's a little bit easier to pick holes in sometimes. So in the second part of this program, we're going to go into the budget and talk about some of the concerns that you might have and some of the concerns that funders have when they look at your budgets. But it should tell the same story in the same reasonable way that your narrative does. We'll also talk about the supporting materials, all the things that a funder is likely to ask you for, some of the things that you should and should not include in every grant proposal. And hopefully I will answer any of the questions that you might have about writing these proposals as we go on. I do want to talk about researching now. And I'm not going to go too deeply into this because I think you have a good opportunity through Toledo Lucas County to access Foundation Directory Online. But that's the tool that Candid has put together that allows you to find funders. Essentially, if you describe your program and what you're looking for funding for and where it's going to happen and who you're going to be serving, you can find a match between what you're doing and what funders are out there giving money away. You can subscribe to it, and I encourage you to do that if it's something that you're going to use on a regular basis every day. But you can also get it for free from our Funding Information Network partners. And it is freely available by searching through this little link. You can find what's the nearest one to you. I would assume that for many of you, most of you, it's Toledo Lucas County Public Library. Zach, what's the current status of somebody wanting to search Foundation Directory Online for you guys?
So we do have the FDO Essentials available on our website with access through your library card. But if you want to use the professional version, the full version, we are closed to walk-ins, but we are open to the public by appointment right now. So you can email me and set up an appointment, or call me and set up an appointment to use our grants terminal.
That's great. And you do regular classes as well, teaching people how to use this online.
Yeah, I do a lot of one-on-one sessions, and then a couple times a year I do some group training on it as well.
Okay, that's great. So you will find that if you're not from the Toledo area or you're traveling, you know that you can also find this throughout the United States and actually internationally as well. And each library, because of the COVID situation, is dealing with walk-ins and appointments and different things differently. So I encourage you to call them before you set out to do something. Many of them will have a free version of a more not as expanded version of our database available for you from home as well. So find out what you can do there. But this database focuses on the things that are most important. Who are you serving? What are you doing for them, and where? Most of the grant makers that you're going to be working with, that you're going to be identifying, are located either in the area that they're giving money, or they are in some way concerned with it. Say they were a family that made all their money in Toledo. They want to give their money back to the people that made them rich in the first place. So they start a foundation and they fund in the Toledo area. Or a company like a bank that has branches all across the country. The places where they want to give their donations aren't just everywhere. It's everywhere where that bank is, everywhere where the bank gets employees and where the bank gets customers. That's what you will see when you do research. So the more detail you can give them about where exactly you're serving people and the number of different kinds of people that you serve, the better. And one more tip about searching. Most of the time people think of their program in a simple way. We provide after-school education. We provide food for starving people. We provide senior services. And you tend to summarize things quickly. One thing you should know is that most foundations don't just think about one aspect of it. Some foundations might be interested in what you do because of the people that you're serving. You serve African Americans, you serve seniors, and they'll connect with you that way. Think also about the funders that are out there that are interested because of where you're benefiting. Maybe they're interested in building up Toledo and making the community better, and they'll be very interested because of your geography. And the third way is maybe they're interested in what you care most about. They're interested in anybody who's working to alleviate disease or to make sure that COVID treatments are available throughout the community. Don't just assume one thing about your program is what a funder is interested in. Think about all the things that you would talk about. And that's another thing that I hope you guys were thinking about when you met and discussed this is, what is it that I tell people? What gets their attention? What makes sure that I can connect with them? That connection, when we talk about it in relation to funders, is called the fit. And I'll talk more about this as we go on and talk about the relationship. We think about everything that we do and all of the different funding instruction that we give by concentrating on what funders specifically really want to know. What is it that they are looking to find out about your organization? Because we've worked with funders for a long time and we know that the world of philanthropy thinks a particular way, that's what we concentrate on, what funders really want to know. And so the first thing that they are often talking about is, what specific need are you addressing? This is the number one concern of a funder. When they decide who are they matching up with, who are they fitting with, they decide based on what your need is, what the specific need that you are addressing in the community. This is not your need as in I need money, or I need to buy, I need to pay personnel, or I need to get a copy machine. It's not that. It's the need that they see that you are responding to in the community. And it can be as simple as, I'm making sure that these people's don't go hungry. I'm making sure that these people receive their vaccines for all diseases. It has to be something that you're able to talk about that addresses what they're concerned about. So you want to talk about the need of the community that you serve. You could say something like, well, the need that we respond to is the need of poverty. Poverty is a nationwide issue. Yeah, poverty is a nationwide issue, but what a funder who's going to fund you for that program is most concerned about is, what is the poverty issue in your area? So you can't just say this is a problem. You have to back it up with some statistics and additional information. Let me ask Hannah to share a couple of handouts in the chat. One of them is a blank outline of a particular grant proposal. It's going to be an outline that enables you to go through and fill in all the different blanks. And if you want to download this right now, you can go ahead and do that, and you'll have it there to work with as we go through the whole proposal. The second outline is a second link that she's going to put in the chat box, is a sample outline that's already been completed. And I want to open that up and just show it to you just for a second here. So I'm going to bring it up on my screen. And okay. Can everybody see this? Are you seeing Candid Proposal Project Outline Sample? No? Okay. No. That's, yeah, sometimes that's when sharing becomes tricky. I can see it. I'll share it with you guys so you can see it. Here we go. This is the Candid Proposal Project Outline Sample. This is a completed version of what we just gave you as a blank. But I want to start by talking about it because I want to talk about that need as it's drawn in here. The need is why the project is necessary. That's the shortest way of putting it. If you can't describe why your project is so necessary for the community, there's going to be no funder that is interested in it. There's going to be nothing that a funder grabs onto and says, this is what I care about. And you can see that this particular project, you see it's the Wisdom Exchange project, comes from an organization called After School Central. The Wisdom Exchange project is a detailed description of, is a way of summarizing a tutoring program between seniors tutoring elementary school students in writing. It's a pretty basic description, but the need that they respond to is very clear. It's that many students are reading below grade level at Public School 111. That's one of the needs that they've identified in their community. And so they want to back that up. So they need supporting facts and statistics. And one of the supporting facts and statistics is that the standardized tests are low in that district. And you can get that from the state, you can get that from the school district itself, but you can prove this is an issue that somebody should care about. The second need that they've identified related to their project is about the seniors. Senior citizens are in need of meaningful volunteer work opportunities. And they use supporting facts to back that up, and they have a quote from the Surgeon General regarding a correlation with seniors who volunteer and a higher quality of life. This is not something that is as rooted in the community when they prove it. It's something that's proven nationally and internationally. Seniors need things to do. But you could add additional information that would make it stronger. One thing you could add would be a survey of seniors in your area. That might be the supporting statistics that you need. Public libraries and places like the Census Bureau have great ways to find statistics and information that will back up and get it as close to the group that you are interested in. If there was a survey done at the senior center that you want to work with, that's a great piece of data that's might directly prove the kind of thing that you want to prove. But you could also go to the Area Agency on Aging. You could go to AARP. You can go to the Surgeon General quote that they have here. You definitely want to make sure that you don't just claim something is a problem without showing who thinks it's a problem as well and where there are details related to that. Any questions about that? I want to take some time here for you guys to do a little activity. So what I'm going to ask Hannah to do is put up another link, and this is the link for the statement of need exercise. So just give her a second to put that in there. Any questions we have so far, by the way? Looks like we're pretty quiet. So I'm going to ask you guys to do some work here. I'm bringing up that document, which you can also download. I encourage you to download it as a PDF, and you can download it directly to your desktop. But what I'm going to do is share it. Give me 1 second here. Oops. Sorry. This is, we get really talented at doing 18 different things at once here when you're doing instruction this way. So here is the needs statement worksheet. And I want you to take about 5 to 10 minutes of work just yourself. You know, you tune us out, mute yourself, turn off your camera, or turn on your camera if we work harder, if we look at you, whatever works, and work on the needs statement of your organization. And the thing that I want you to do is to just complete these 3 questions here. What's the problem you're going to address? Who is affected by this problem? And what data can you use to back it up? So why don't you take, I'm going to just set a timer here and say, let's take 5 to 10 minutes, and I'm going to give us 8 minutes from now. So it's 1:43. I'm going to come back at 1:51. I'm going to say, tell me the answers to those 3 questions. You can write them on a separate sheet. You can write them on scratch paper, whatever works for you. But let's try that for the next 8 minutes. So we'll pause right now. And please do send in any questions that you have. All right. Thank you. If you have any questions while you do this, please do send them in through the chat or unmute yourself and ask. Good. 2 more minutes, everybody. All right. Hope everybody had a chance to do a little bit of work on that and to think about those 3 questions. Can somebody share what they've written down with me? Tell me what the problem is that your organization addresses and who's affected by the problem and what you use to substantiate. You won't be graded on this, but I appreciate it if you could share. Anybody want to unmute themselves and do so?
I can do it. My name is Rob Johnson.
Hi, Rob.
How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. So what is the problem that your organization addresses?
Helping improve the literacy of a school, elementary school that's near our church building.
Okay.
High rate. We have a high rate of elementary age students that are struggling with being able to move forward into the next grade,
Sure.
and are affected by multiple factors, not just poverty, but just struggle. So that would be we don't really have, the goal, of course, is that 100%,
Right.
but so we haven't really specified yet, improving it from say 65% to 85.
Sure.
But that's a goal that we have to really talk with the local, like the teachers and the administrators.
Right. And you can get more into the specific goals as we go on through the proposal, but the need, I think, is clear. I think there's definite need of those affected children, and you have a clear idea of who is affected by the problem. So that's really good. The questions that are there at the top of that worksheet, by the way, are a good way to look at anything that you write afterwards. Do you understand the problem? Is the issue compelling? Clear scale of the problem, description of the target population.
Mm-hmm.
What do you have data that you can use to back that up?
So we're just kind of in the infancy of doing this kind of work.
Mm-hmm.
So we figure, or at least as I've talked with the people in the neighborhood and in the congregation, what sources we could use. And again, some of this is what I've already discussed, but also just as a part of this exercise here.
Sure.
We can use things like standardized tests in reading, and this district, would be helpful with that. We also thought that maybe like graduation rates as a potential, even if it's moving from elementary school to middle school, and maybe looking at looking at maybe particularly middle school improvement or lack of improvement over time, depending how that, that gets a little detailed, but looking at standardized tests, and
you should be able to get that from the schools, from the standardized test scores, and additional information on that specific neighborhood. And there's a lot of different places that you can go to. And if you're not sure, I always do contact the public library and see, what is the best source of data for this. And that's really great. And I think that is really good. And it's definitely compelling because people connect with this need. They connect with the literacy question. Literacy concern is pretty much widespread. And I think that a lot of people are versed, or at least cognizant of the idea that if you don't address literacy early, it becomes a problem that cannot be helped in the later years. It's something that needs to be addressed early on. And if it's something that is continuing in your area, then that's something that needs to be worked on. So that's great. Thank you so much, Rob. I appreciate that. It's a good one. Does anybody else want to share? Well, I know that this is kind of a little bit shy making to be asked to do this out in front of people, but I appreciate Rob's volunteering. Anybody else? All right, I won't pressure you, but I will ask you to look at what you've written down and look at it through the eyes of a funder who's trying to decide from among 100 different grant proposals which 75 or 50 they're able to concern. So they will ask these questions. Does it seem like you understand the problem clearly? Is it compelling to me? If I read this and I see this issue, do I feel hooked in? Do I feel like I'm interested? And have you, the nonprofit, described the scale of the problem? Is it just this neighborhood? Is it something where it is the school district, it is this specific community, and within this community, how bad is the problem? Tell me about the geography, tell me about the demographics and the target population. And if I read it and I want to learn more about it, then you've done the right thing. You have grabbed my attention. That's what the needs statement does, is when you get started in reading a grant proposal and you come across the needs statement, it should draw you in. It should make you feel that you need to know more about how to solve this problem. So take some time. I would encourage you, if you don't want to share it out loud here, to take it and show it to somebody else, somebody who doesn't work for your organization, and say, does this compel you? Does this affect you when you read about it? Do you feel like you want to know more? Do you feel like you want to help? You want to donate? Because that's what is key to making an effective needs statement. The needs statement is just part of the grant proposal, but it's the opening part, and it's the part that the funders concentrate on. But the rest of what you do is to talk about what you're going to try to achieve. And that means that you need to start talking about the project itself. The rest of this part of the narrative is really about the project description. And that project description can be put in some of the application forms, the online forms, or the descriptions of the guidelines for a foundation. They'll tell it different ways, but basically it's tell me how you're going to make a change in this population. How are you going to affect them? What impact, what outcomes are you looking for? It isn't so much outputs, and I'm not going to get into logic models or anything really difficult in this class. If you want to learn about logic models, we have a class coming up in January that you can sign up for, and you'll learn everything you ever wanted to know about how to do a logic model. But if you don't even know what a logic model is, or you don't want to get into it, the important thing to think about is that whatever you say you're going to try and do, it has to be measurable. Your outcome, the thing that you're aiming for, has to be measurable so that a funder can say at the end, after they give you the money, if they want to invest in it, that you can tell whether you succeeded or not, and they can tell whether you succeeded or not. So you have to be able to talk about the things that you are trying to achieve. And it's a good idea to list them in a way that makes them SMART. And I'll tell you what SMART is. SMART is a little handy shorthand for deciding when you say what you're going to do, whether it's specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timely. So is it something that you're going to do that you can make sure that you measure it accurately? And I'm going to stop sharing and go back to that sample that I showed you before. I'm going to pull that up here. The proposal project outline sample. You guys see that? Yeah. The proposal project outline sample that I talked about, we have the need description, and then we go into what are you going to try to achieve? Those would be, another way of saying it is the goals and objectives. The goals are the broad things that you want to achieve. It's something that you could say, if somebody asks you, what's this project about? Where we're going to increase the reading levels for students, and we're going to provide meaningful, rewarding volunteer work opportunities for seniors in this project. Those are the goals. It doesn't tell you a lot of specifics, but it tells you generally what this is about. The objectives are the things where you talk about what outcomes you're aiming for. And they have to be SMART, specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timely. So one thing, for example, could be to recruit 20 students, grades 3 through 6, who are below grade level in reading. That's the first objective, the first thing that you're going to go for when you do. It's an activity that you're going to do, something that you're going to be, that's going to be part of how you're going to get to the outcome that you need. You need to recruit 20 students, grades 3 through 6, who are below grade level in reading. That's specific and measurable. You know exactly how many students you're going to do. The second objective listed here is to increase the reading levels of at least 75% of the student participants to their grade level. That is an important thing to list. And I'm going to ask people to share in chat, why should it be 75%? Or why is 75% a good thing? Why not 100%? Can anybody answer that in chat? Why not 100%? Don't be shy. Or you can unmute yourself and just say it. We have a lot of Zach Cubers. Oh, go ahead.
This is Lee Utley. I am. I was just reading the chat because it's realistic. It's unrealistic to think that 100% of people are going to improve. You have to kind of give way to those people that aren't going to, make headway in your programming.
Absolutely.
So you still want to have.
Yeah, it's not realistic. You don't want to say, I'm going to make sure that 100% of the kids who are involved in my program are going to get exactly what they need. 100% is setting yourself up to fail. You want to have something that's achievable and realistic. So thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And it has to be feasible. As Amanda said, it's very difficult to achieve 100%. So 75%, I would imagine, if I'm writing this out and setting it out, is a realistic amount given your experience, giving similar programs in the past, laying out what you hope to achieve. The thing to make sure that you do when you write a grant proposal is not to just say, well, we hope that a majority will do this, or we hope that a great number. It doesn't excite people to read that kind of generalized idea. They want to have a specific outcome, a measurable outcome. And 75% is definitely something that could be measurable. The next objective in this particular one is to recruit, train, and retain at least 20 seniors as tutors for 1 year. Tells me, what are you going to try to achieve? And later on, when you talk about evaluation, which you're going to have to do as part of the grant proposal, you will be able to go back and say, Well, we had an objective to recruit, train, and retain at least 20 seniors. We plan to measure that by having ongoing measurement that tracks the number that we get. And then later on, when you report on it, you will be able to tell whether or not you reached it. Everything you list out in an objective, everything you list out as something that you are going to try to achieve in your project should be something that later on, if you got the grant, you should be able to tell whether or not you met this and measure whether or not you met this. Talk a little bit more about evaluation in just a minute. Go back to the slides here. So you have objectives, you have things that you are going for, outcomes that you hope to be able to measure. The next thing you want to talk about is the methods, the strategies for making your proposal work, making this happen. So think of your proposal as an organizing plan. That's essentially what a grant proposal is. It's a story, but it also organizes things the way a story does. It organizes it in a clear narrative. So first, we're going to do this, and next, we're going to do that. Once somebody's reading this, they know what need you're responding to, they know what you are aiming to accomplish. The next thing they need to know is that you know how to do it. And that's difficult for some people because the methods section can be very challenging if you've never done a project before. I think of it as an organizing plan. I think of it sometimes as a timeline. So if you decide you were going to do a particular thing, you have a timeline to set up to do it. And during the first 3 months, you're going to try to do these things. And during the next 3 months, you're going to try to do these things. If you think of it as an organizing plan, you don't leave out the vital stuff that you need to tell a funder that will convince them that you know how the project works. When I used to read grant proposals, one of the biggest challenges I had was people that didn't seem to see how things flowed from beginning to end. They'll say, well, you know, on the first day, we're going to hire somebody to do this. And then the following Monday, we're going to do this. I'm like, you don't hire somebody in a day. It takes time. It takes time to recruit. It takes time to bring people on. You have to work that into your timeline. We're going to have 17 new staff members do this. I'm like, how are you going to hire 17 people in the time to do it? Most of the places where I could pick apart a grant proposal weren't in the ideas, weren't in the aims, the objectives, but were in the methods of actually getting it done. I wanted to know a lot of different things when I was reading about how the project was going to work. I wanted to know what people were going to be responsible. So I wanted to know details on the people that are going to do the work. I also wanted to know, are you collaborating with anybody? Because collaboration is not just attractive to funders because they love it when people work together. It's attractive to funders because it makes the job possible. We have this program here that we've been looking at in the outline, and it's a tutoring program with seniors coming from a senior center and students coming from a school. If you don't have a working partnership with a senior center, at least one, and a school, you can't do the project at all. So that collaboration isn't just a luxury, it's essential. And funders are looking to see that if you say, we're going to work with X, that you actually have talked to X. And don't be surprised if they call X on the phone and say, we have a grant proposal from this organization. Do you know anything about it? And if they say no, that's not going to help you. So when you talk about what your strategies are for making something happen, think about stating it so that somebody can follow how this project will work from beginning to end. If you do that, if you talk about you outline what you're going to do, what your objectives are, how your methods are going to go, then you can talk about how to evaluate its success. And that to me is sometimes the easiest thing to do and sometimes the hardest thing to do. We have this project that I was talking about, the seniors tutoring elementary school students. It's easy to see if the tutoring has worked. So because you test them at the beginning and they read at a particular level, like Rob's literacy program, you test them, they read at a particular level. After they go through the project, you want to test them again and maybe they read at a different level, a higher level. And that's how you measure whether you're successful or not. We're going to raise them to their reading level. Well, we have to test them to find that. That's pretty easy. It's harder sometimes to measure other kinds of outcomes. How do we know seniors had a rewarding time? You can't test them to see that they were rewarded, but you can survey them. You can use a tool to measure their satisfaction, their happiness, their feelings of self-worth. You can decide, I'm going to use a tool at the beginning and a tool at the end to measure that. Both of those are great ways of evaluating the success of a program. And a funder, generally, a private foundation does not expect you to hire somebody to work this out. They expect you to build it into the program design so that you can measure whether or not a program was successful. The other thing they want, though, when they talk about evaluation isn't just beginning and end. You know, I can say, well, we tested them at the beginning and they read at this low level, and then we did a whole bunch of other things, and then we tested them at the end and they read at this level, and that's great, it went up. But it doesn't tell me what happened in between. It doesn't tell me that what I was doing was actually having the effect. Maybe it was something else that I was doing. So one of the things you also have to do, in addition to measuring beginning and end, is to have some way in place for measuring the process. And that is monitoring the success of the program. So if you've ever been in a tutoring program, you know that the tutors and the tutees are not always matched perfectly. You have to have a way of getting feedback on that. So one of the things you could do was have a way of measuring this. Let's stop and look at the outline again. Sorry. Stop sharing and go to the outline. So here's this outline again. And here's information about the methods and staffing and partnerships. But the evaluation, two things you should notice. They have the pre and the post test. That's the evaluating the beginning and the end. But they also have student folders with progressive work samples. So if I'm trying to decide whether I'm teaching the students what they need to learn about reading, then I need to have a way of measuring that. And so I need to keep track of how well they do. So if they have student folders where they write in each week and the tutor looks at it, they're able to keep track the steps that took from beginning to end. The other thing is, if you run into problems, you have to have some sort of preparation to make sure that you can address them. And one of those is to have regular meetings. If you have regular meetings with the staff and the tutors, the volunteers and the tutors, you can hear when the tutor and tutee are not matched well, or if somebody is going to have to quit the program, or if somebody is having troubles. You record the successful procedures and you address the obstacles encountered. If I'm going to invest my money in you, I'm a foundation, I want to know that you're keeping track of whether or not the program is meeting its goals and whether things are getting done the way that they're supposed to do. So the more you have details on keeping track, the better off you're going to be. All right. A couple other things that you need to share in the narrative. And then after we talk about the narrative, I think we'll take a little bit of a break so that you guys can refocus. Why are you the best organization to do this kind of work? So you have described what it is that you're going to do. You've described how you're going to measure its success and keep track of its success. Why should it be you that gets the investment of money? This is a question that is implied. Sometimes it's the first question that a funder asks on their form. Tell us about your organization. And they don't just mean, well, tell us, what you normally tell everybody about your organization. They mean, tell us why we should trust your organization as an investment. Why should we give to you what makes you so great? And that's really what this is about. And it's something that I used to keep on my desktop to insert in all the different grant proposals that I was writing. I wanted to be able to say, well, here's why we're the best organization. So I didn't change it because our history was pretty much the same, but I used it to reinforce that we are been around for 75 years. we've provided X amount of people with the services they need. We've done this, we've done that. That's great. And you need to be able to talk about it so that a funder will know who you are. Sometimes they may not recognize your name, but they'll recognize what you've accomplished. And so anything that you would normally use to tell you, to persuade people to donate to you, to give, to care about what you do, you would use that. One problem that some organizations have is that they're new. They don't have this long history. They don't have the ability to say, well, we've been around for 75 years. If you're the Red Cross or Big Brothers Big Sisters or Boys and Girls Club, you can talk about who you are and people will recognize it. But if you're a new organization, what you have to talk about is what makes you worthy of investment. Right now, if you're dealing with COVID, you may have a way of dealing with it that is slightly different than a lot of organizations. Maybe you're more connected to the community. Maybe you've somebody who's not done this work for a long time, but you've been in the community for a long time. That's great. Maybe the people that are starting your organization have a long history of social work and social service in the community. What would you brag about when you're talking about your new organization? And use that. It doesn't mean just because you're new that you are not worthy of getting a grant, but you have to work a little bit harder to describe what makes your organization worthy of investment. I'm sorry, question.
I just wanted to ask a question.
Yes.
When it comes to, why are you the best organization to do this work?
Right.
If you're bringing a new initiative into the community, and you would be the first of its kind.
Yeah, so you're not just the first, you're not just the best, you're the only organization doing this.
Okay.
That's a definite advantage.
Okay.
And you really should think about that. I mean, there's a lot of after-school programs out there, but there's not a lot of after-school programs that do exactly what Boys and Girls Club does or do exactly what Big Brothers Big Sisters do. What is it that makes you distinctive? That is a great point as well. Does that help answer?
Yeah. Yes, it does. Yes.
Okay,
thank you.
You're welcome. Last main thing in a grant narrative, the project narrative, after you talk about the need, after you talk about the project and how it's going to work and how you're going to measure its success and why you should do it, is how is it going to pay for itself in the future? And this was a question that came up in the initial discussions that everybody had. Yeah, sustaining yourself. Why should I invest in you? Who else is going to invest as well? So you have two questions that are really implied in this. How are you going to pay for this now? And how is it going to pay for itself in the future? How is somebody else going to pay for it in the future? The foundation you are writing to and asking for a grant is not going to want to, A, be the only funder for a project. 99 times out of 100, they do not want to be the only funder for the project. And secondly, they don't want to be signed on to keep giving you grants every year. And if they don't give you the grant, the project goes away. They want to be able to know that if they invest in your project, it's going to keep going and keeping doing the work. So here's a first question is, how are you going to sustain yourself this year? Well, tell the funder where else you are looking to get support from. And you can use different categories. We are raising money for this project. 25% of it will come from individual donations. We have a commitment of 50% from X Foundation. We are looking to raise 25% of our funding through other grants and an event. Tell me where the money is coming from. In the budget section, you're going to be asked to reveal where you plan to get that and break it down the similar way. But you can state it in narrative here. The other thing you want to talk about in this section is your plan for the future. Is it something that after this year you'll be able to charge for it and you won't have to ask for grants? Maybe you're going to be tying into United Way funding or government funding. Maybe you're going to have regular events that are going to support this. Maybe you're going to continue to fundraise. You don't know exactly necessarily how you're going to pay for the project in the long run, but you have to have a plan. You can't just say, well, we're going to ask you for money and then later, we'll worry about that next year. Tell me why this project is going to sustain itself, how it's going to do that. And your plan may change. Next year, you may write a completely different sustainability plan. But I want to know that you have one for this year, or I won't be able to invest in your project. I want to know that it's going to last. So that's important to address. Last part of a narrative, and if the funder asks you, sometimes they'll ask you to write this. They won't give you any guidelines other than this is what we want you to deal with in these paragraphs. In that case, you pull it from the outline, the sample outline that we showed you, the blank outline that you would fill in. You pull it from the outline and write it as a story, write it as a narrative. Sometimes they'll have forms, and if you've ever approached, there's the Cleveland Foundation. I know for a fact they have this question, but I'm sure there are many other questions similar to it on other application forms. What's something that you haven't mentioned yet? The conclusion is where you add that something that hasn't really come up yet. And that something is, why are you asking this funder for money? Why specifically them? So you've talked about your project and how well it's going to go and how you're going to pay for it and all that sort of stuff. But tell me why, as a reader of this grant proposal, I should care. My foundation should care. Because of your long-standing interest in education in the Toledo area, we write to you to be a partner in this project. That's the kind of thing that you want to put in the conclusion. Link to it based on the research that you did on this funder. Make sure, maybe they've already funded you in the past, and you can say something like, because of your longstanding support of our organization, we hope you will continue to be a partner for this. You have a connection and you show what it is. But if they're new, tell me what makes you think that they would care. That conclusion, you don't have to agonize over it. It doesn't have to be very long. It doesn't have to be exactly the most perfect words ever. But it does have to tell that funder that there's a reason why they're reading it. And there's a reason why they should then go to their trustees and say, we should fund it. That conclusion is the last part of the narrative. And I'm going to talk about just a couple things and then we'll take a break. The executive summary summarizes everything that goes in so far. So you've had that need statement and the project description and the conclusion and the organization description. One thing I always try to do early on in a process when I'm trying to fundraise for a project is to have a summary, a one-page summary done. Because number one, you get asked for that in a lot of grant proposals. They ask you to fill that in either in an online form or as part of the overall request. And secondly, this gets read, this kind of thing gets read more than almost anything else, because they'll read your grant proposal, they'll study your budget, and then when they want to remind themselves what your project is about, they'll read the executive summary. So make sure that it includes the most essential parts of everything that follows. How would you boil everything down to one readable page? And spend a little bit of time making sure that it has all the vital parts that the whole proposal has in a one-page kind of document. One page that tells me, here's the need that they're responding to, here's what they're doing, here's how they're going to pay for it, here's why it should be them that does it. That's what an executive summary should do. And that usually will go on top of a grant proposal and be followed by the supporting materials. The supporting materials are everything that the funder asks in addition to the narrative. It's going to be the budget. We'll talk about the budget separately. But it's also going to be the kind of things that they typically ask for. And that would be an audited financial statement or a 990 or a budget, overall organizational budget for your organization. I used to keep all this stuff in one file folder that I could pull from online, to attach to things or to print out so that I wouldn't lose it and I wouldn't have to hurry. I look at the supporting materials, and I learned this the hard way. I look at what the funder wants as supporting materials first when I read their guidelines, because if I don't have something there, I know I'm going to get to the end of writing that grant proposal and I'm going to have to find it really fast. And if it takes me a couple of days to get it together, or I have to meet with our accountant to get it together, then I don't want that situation. So look at those supporting materials. Don't generally include anything they don't ask for, but if you can't include what they ask for, find out from them by talking to them what you can send instead. Is there a way that you can send 990 or a financial review rather than an audit? Find out what it is they absolutely need. If you don't know, contact them and ask. All right. So we don't have any questions right now, and I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to say that we should probably take a break. I think everybody might be okay with that. It's 2:24. I'm going to suggest we take 15 minutes and come back. Let's give you 16 minutes, and we'll come back at 2:40. So I'm going to turn my camera off, and I'm going to mute myself, and I'm going to see you guys go get a drink, go get some food, take it easy, and we'll see you at 2:40 according to my clock. Well, welcome back, everybody. Hope you had a good break and you're energized and re-energized. I'm going to share a couple of things before we get started, but the first thing I wanted to do is ask Heather Bradley from the Center for Nonprofit Resources at Toledo Community Foundation to talk a little bit about what's going on with them. So hi, Heather. She's one of our Zachary Hubers here. Oh, you're muted, Heather. Sorry.
I think I know how to do this by now. Thank you.
Oh.
And no, I'm not Zachary, but he was kind enough to help me get in because, of course, this never happens to anybody else. I couldn't find my link. So I'm usually on the other end helping people. If you don't know me, I'm with the Center for Nonprofit Resources. We have the great opportunity to support organizations like yours. I recognize many of you on the call today, which is great. I want to thank the library for bringing David to town. We're always excited when David could come and share his expertise. And I'm in a little bit of a learning mode in that we traditionally do not host any workshops or trainings in July or December because, at least historically, people weren't interested in doing things in December. And here we are. Look at all of you. So we're learning some things about what can work for you and make sense. We have completed our formal programming for the year, but we are working feverishly behind the scenes to make sure that we're pulling together things for 2021. Regrettably, it's still going to be a bit of a crazy start in the first quarter. I think that's obvious. And if you're not familiar with the center, I would invite you to check us out, our website. I'll say it fast and then I'll give you the letters, c4npr.org. So C as in cat, the number 4, N as in Nancy, P as in Peter, R as in Robert.org. And it's short for, oh, look at that. Of course, somebody could put it in the chat box. But it's short for Center for Nonprofit Resources, so you don't have to type the whole thing out. And there are 4 big areas that we could help you with. We support Northwest Ohio and Southeast Michigan. That's who our funders invest in at this time. And we have professional development, including 2 signature certificate programs. We have technical assistance, which is a fancy word for consulting. There's an online request form. If you want help with something, you can find that in the Getting Help section of the website. Take you 3 minutes or less to complete, I promise. It's a short one. We have hundreds and hundreds of online resources that are at no cost on the website. You can start typing in what you want in the search box and it offers solutions. And also engagement. So if you want to follow along with us, we have a no-cost e-news that comes out every other week. That's where we make all of our big announcements. That we also highlight the funding opportunities from the Greater Toledo Community Foundation. We're a program of that foundation. You can also find us on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. I think that's it. David, thank you so much for allowing me for a few minutes just to say hey to the group.
No, glad to see you, Heather, and I'm so glad that you guys are there. And Toledo has a fantastic resource in the center, so I hope that you will look up their website and look them up. So thank you. I want to share also one more, while we're talking about websites, I'm going to share my screen and share a website that we have as one of the links that we're going to come up later, but I just wanted to bring it up right now. It's called Candid Learning, and it was formerly known as Grant Space. We rebranded it with our new Candid logo and Candid colors, and you get very familiar with this yellow and black combination here, gold and black, that we have for Candid Learning. Candid Learning is the place where we collect all of our resources that will help you out. It links to all of our training classes, but it also links to answers to different questions that we offer. It has a topics section if you're interested in a particular element of nonprofit work, fundraising, proposal writing, management, governance, starting a nonprofit. It also has a list of resources, and the resources that I want to point out, and I'll point them out again later, are the sample documents. So within Candid Learning, if you are looking for examples of grant proposals and proposal budgets and letter proposals, shorter versions, letters of inquiry, what a lot of funders ask before you send in a full proposal. We have actual fully funded proposals that you can download. You know, you can't, of course, photocopy them and send them to anybody, but you can use them as models for what you put together. So if you were looking for good model for what you are working on, or maybe you're looking for something that specifically talks about, you know, how to do a particular thing, how to write a grant request and ask for general operating support, you can see how other people have done it successfully in the past. So this resource is one that you can use for free, learning.candid.org, and I think that Hannah has added it to the chat, and hopefully you guys will be able to see it. So I'm going to stop sharing this right now and take a look at those websites, and hopefully they will help you out. All right, well, thank you guys for the first half, and I hope you got a good sense of the narrative in a grant proposal. The second part of this is going to be more about the budget and creating that. And I think people have, I don't know if it's a reasonable fear or an unreasonable fear about the budget in a grant proposal. The budget in a grant proposal is looked at probably more than anything else by a funder. And I do know some funders who that's what they turn to first. I do know that when I was at a foundation and we would have our board meeting, we would all gather together and we would look at the grant proposal. Maybe we would read a little bit from the executive summary of the grant proposal. But then when the real discussion was happening among the trustees and the real decisions about what to fund and what not to fund were happening, we opened to the budget page and we looked at that budget and we read it as the story that it was telling. And the questions that came up, one of my goals when I was a program officer for a foundation was to have the answers to any questions that might come up when I looked at a budget. So my advice to you, if you're not familiar with budgets, if you're not comfortable with budgets, my advice to you is to think of questions that could be asked. What your job is to eliminate questions. When you create a budget for a project, your idea is make this as clear as possible so that nobody looks at this and says, what is this other $5,000? What is that for? I'm not going to fund this. I don't even know what they're spending their money on. You don't want to hear those kind of things when your budget is reviewed. So I encourage anything you can add to a budget to make it clear. Sometimes you don't have a choice of the form. There will be foundations that say, well, you have to use our form and it has to have this and it has to be, or it has to be an Excel spreadsheet, or it can't be an Excel spreadsheet. There'll be all sorts of different restrictions. Some funders don't give you any kind of restrictions. The thing is, when you create it for yourself, you want to make sure it makes sense to you and it makes sense within the context of your organization. So I say that it can be anybody that creates a budget, but it should be a budget that your accountant can look at, your financial person can review, and your financial person can contribute to. So you don't want to do this blind. You don't want to make up things. Nothing is more obvious to a funder than when you are making a budget up from thin air. So I'm going to go through some of this and I'll give you a chance to do some of your own work on it. But here's the way that we think about it. Just like we think about the narrative, we think about what funders want to see in project budgets. And what they want is the true cost of the project. It's tempting to say, well, you know, they'll fund me if I can lowball them. So they get 10 requests and we're only asking for $2,500 when everybody else is asking for $10,000, they'll want to fund us. That's not true. They want to see a budget that is put together reasonably. And that doesn't always mean it's the cheapest project any more than when you get an estimate, the cheapest guy is necessarily the best. That doesn't follow. They want to see that you understand how the project works. And they want to understand that you know, or at least have a plan to get the income to meet those costs. If your budget is $25,000 and that's your expenses, you also should have a plan in place of where you're going to raise $25,000 to pay for those expenses. They should be the same. So the components of a project budget are the two parts that I just mentioned. Income, which includes grant and contributions, includes any earned income that will go towards the project. When that earned income includes fees for services and sale of goods. And then it also includes expenses. And that's what most people think of when they think of a budget. They think of the expenses, laying out everything you need to pay for. Well, they should balance exactly. The expenses are probably more complicated to put together. Income, we can describe it and I'll go through it and you'll get details. But most people, when they start this, they start thinking about expenses. And they start thinking about what are the costs for this project. The costs for any project that you are going to be doing fall into two main categories. And they are direct and indirect costs. And I'm going to talk about both of these. And hopefully you will learn some of the terminology as we go on here. Another thing that's available on Candid Learning is links to information on budget pages and frequently asked questions about budgets that you might want to take a look at. But direct and indirect costs is one thing that you definitely need to know about. Direct costs, it's pretty simple. Everything that is directly necessary for this project. So whatever project within your whole organization it is, whatever you're doing, if you're doing an after-school program, if you're doing a seniors program, if you're doing a food service program, if you're doing an arts program, the direct costs are everything that's directly necessary to run that, including everybody that's going to work on it, the personnel, and everything you need to buy in addition to the people time that you're using as personnel. So personnel and non-personnel. Indirect costs, I'm going to go into a little bit more detail in just a bit. And that's overhead. That is everything that is not directly necessary for the project. And we'll define this a little bit more exactly later on. But the simple truth is, if you know your project, if you know what you're going to do, you can plan a budget. It's not impossible. Your budget should always be a mirror reflection of your proposal, your narrative of your grant proposal translated into numbers. Everything that's in your proposal, everything that you think would be an expense, everything that you are going to have to make sure it happens, that should be represented in your budget. So somebody looking at your budget, there's a reason why they can see how the project is going to work, because you've delineated exactly where the expenses are and how it's going to run. One question that we get asked often when people are putting together budgets is, how do I know how to do this? How do I know to put the project amounts? Particularly when new organizations are starting and trying to decide how to put a budget together. How do I know what everything is going to cost? Well, you have to get estimates. I encourage you to get 3 estimates. And as I said earlier, you don't have to always take the lowest estimate, but when you make a decision about the estimates that you get for a particular product, for a particular service, for a particular element of what you do, that should be justified. You can collect and document your quotes. You won't necessarily have to share those quotes, but choose the estimate that's most reasonable for your and appropriate for your project. I use an example of a projection system that I had. We got grant funding to put in a projection system in back when people used to go into the office, if you remember. We had a projection system put into our offices, and I got 3 estimates. And the first estimate was for something like $25,000 to rewire a whole section of thing and to install and get the equipment and all that. And I thought, that's kind of high. I'll get a second estimate. And the second estimate was $5,000. What do you do with that? Which one is right? Well, I don't know enough to know which one is right, but I do want to know which one is the more reasonable given somebody else looking at it. So I did get a third estimate, and it turns out that the $5,000 estimate was closer to reality than the $25,000. But you don't necessarily know reality unless you kind of triangulate it. So that's the reasoning behind this. When you estimate costs, I know it's not much fun to do that. It's not the easiest thing in the world to do. But when you estimate costs, remember that you're considering a number of different things. You're considering, first of all, who's working on the project. And when you're talking about personnel costs, we're talking about direct costs here. And remember the definition, directly related to the project. So who's working on the project? I'm sorry, do we have a question? Nope. Okay. Thought I heard somebody raising a question. If you do have questions, by the way, please do send them in chat and we will get to them at a stopping place here. So who are the individuals working on the project? Who are all the people that are going to be devoting any time to the project? If you were like most nonprofits, not everybody spends 100% of their time working on one project. They spend their time working on a number of projects. The executive director might spend 5% of their time on one project and 5% on another and 5% on a third and 10% on a fourth. It keeps going. Sometimes you have somebody who spends all of their time on the project and then that's calculated. But you need to know who's working on the project. You need to know then how much time will they dedicate to the project. And it's not drawn in here, but one way you could say is through a percentage. 50% of their time, 20% of their time. They get a salary, whatever their salary is. So the amount that they would be paid would be a percentage of their salary, depending on what time they're spending on the project. Let's think of the executive director as an example. Executive director, let's make it nice and easy. They make $100,000 a year, whatever they work on. That's their salary. That's what they get paid. But for the purpose of this project, they spend 10% of their time supervising the project. So they should get 10% of that salary from the project. So their budget would be $10,000 or 10% of $100,000. That is pretty straightforward. It's also straightforward when you have somebody who's spending 100% of their time. So your program director makes $50,000 a year, they spend 100% of their time on it, $50,000. That's how much they're going to get from this project. Different people are going to have different percentages of time. What you can't do and what you shouldn't do is just guess. You say that your executive director spends 25% of their time on this project and 25% of their time on 5 other projects, something is wrong. So you need to talk to your financial person and make sure you correctly estimate how much money the executive director is getting from this project. Don't think that funders don't look at that. Don't think that funders don't wonder if you suddenly say, well, it looks like you have one person working on this project and they're going to get 95% of their salary from this project. It looks to me like you've invented a way to get this person's salary paid that doesn't really have a lot to do with what they do. Funders pay attention. So you put in salary and wages for the different personnel, but there's another step, benefits. How much do you add for benefits? And the thing about that is that when you are trying to do the true cost of any project, the true cost is not just what you pay a member of your personnel in salary, because anybody who works for you is probably getting benefits. Sorry, we don't have a benefits page here, but I do want to have Hannah put in to the chat a little publication about calculating fringe benefit rate. But I'll just summarize it by saying that every organization has a different fringe benefit rate. Some of you are having a fringe benefit rate of like 35% of your salary, meaning say everybody on your organization makes $1 million. That's the overall salary for the whole organization. If you spend $350,000 on benefits, that's insurance and that's taxes and all the different things that you have to pay to somebody other than that person so that person can work there, that's $350,000 will be 35%. What is the right fringe benefit rate? Well, it's not, there isn't a right fringe benefit rate. It varies depending on what your organization is. And that link that we will send you will have a way to calculate it. But the best thing to do is to talk to your financial person, talk to your accountant. They can tell you how much you spend on fringe benefits. Adding in a percentage as fringe benefit rates, say your subtotal there on that form would be 100,000. You could do a fringe benefit rate of 25%. That's 25,000. And then your personnel total would be the total of the salaries and wages that come above, plus the 25,000 for fringe. The personnel total is 125,000, and that's the real cost of those personnel. Hope you understand that, because that's what making a budget is about, is putting the real costs together and making sure that you know exactly what things cost and that you're not shortchanging yourself. You could eliminate fringe benefits. You could say, I'm not going to have those in my calculation. That's fine. But you're going to have to get that money from somewhere. So that's why there's always a question about, well, can we get general operating money? A lot of funders don't like to give general operating money. So if you don't have another source for the $25,000 or whatever that you're going to pay for benefits, you have to find it. It's better to roll it in to every project budget. Next thing I'm going to talk about in the direct costs realm is non-personnel costs. And those are everything that is not people that work for your organization, including people, but not necessarily people that are employees of your organization. So consultants don't get benefits. You hire them maybe hourly, however they work, whatever it is, it's not going to be exactly the same. So think about the consultants when you were doing this. Who are the other people working on this project? Do you have to hire them? This middle part that you see here where the blanks are in the middle, that's a good place where you can identify the definitions of these different things. So if you put something like consultants in there, you wouldn't want to just put consultants $10,000. What you want to do is put that something in that middle space that says, these are 5 tutors we are hiring at $250 a week for 4 weeks or whatever it is, that shows the calculation. That calculation, just like the percentage of time that we talked about in the personnel costs, that calculation written in there is what we call budget narrative. I am a big fan of budget narrative because I looked at a lot of grant proposals and a lot of budgets that didn't have any explanations of where these numbers came from. And my first question to all of the people who submitted those budgets was, where'd you get this number? Budget narrative simply explains, why is this number this and where did it come from? So some people use them as footnotes in budgets. Some people put them right there in the narrative, right there in the middle of the, in the middle of the spreadsheet, so they explain each thing. But you need to know what it means when somebody says something. When you say something like travel, if you put travel $10,000, I'm assuming that you're going to jet set away to the Caribbean for something. I don't know what that travel is. You put travel $10,000, you have to explain what that is. What's travel? What kind of transportation does this project need? Who's going where? What's the cost of it? Is it about renting a car, renting a van, getting a bus? What is it? Food, beverage. What's the food, beverage there for? If you run a program that works with people after work or works with after school kids, food and beverage, that's a way of making sure that these people that are being served attend these programs. You know, you don't want to make these people come to something that they're hungry for. You have to have, for any kind of project, a way of making sure that the people that are taking advantage of the project are able to concentrate and able to be present in the situation. So food and beverage is perfectly allowable as long as it makes sense. And the way that you make sure that it makes sense is to explain it with budget narrative. The other stuff that's on here program equipment, program space, program evaluation. Notice how it all refers to the program. We're not talking about the overall printing for the organization, the overall travel for the organization, or the overall program space, or overall space for the organization. It's only the direct costs for the program. Remember that. Direct costs, as we mentioned earlier, are personnel and non-personnel added together. That comes
Dave.
out. Yes, question.
Yeah, we do have a question in the chat real quick. Robert Johnson wants to know what your opinion is of nonprofits and project managers using program or profit margin ratios when calculating project costs.
In what way? So like, give me a for example for what you're talking about. And you can unmute yourself, Rob, if you want to do that.
Yep. No. So, is there, when we're calculating a budget, we're calculating a budget for, or establishing a budget for a program, and we should be considering expenses and income.
Okay.
Is it helpful for us to consider? Are we only focusing on the narrative of what the need is and what the expenses, what the income is needed to meet that need, or should there be some conversation between expenses and income? I mean, obviously, we're not going to spend more. We shouldn't be spending more than what we take in, ideally, but over the course of my work in at least in churches, I try to have a sense of what it is, try to have a kind of a look at what income we're making,
right,
relative to the expenses. I use a ratio. There are a couple of nonprofit ratios that I will use to provide some clarity as to where we actually are for the sustainability of the organization.
Okay, so you're asking, should we use ratios like that in deciding how to put the budget together? I would say, is that what your question was?
Sort of, but
yeah,
with an eye towards sustainability, and enabling, especially if there's a multi-year grant, for example, that we're using, would a profit margin or that kind of a ratio, a budgetary ratio, help inform the narrative that we would speak to the sustainability?
Absolutely. That's the short answer. I'm trying to keep it sort of on the non-accounting level and the non-theoretical level in terms of planning. But when you're doing a budget, if you've used ratios that justify an expense, if we bring in this much money, we'll be able to serve this many people, that kind of ratio. Or if you have another way of estimating what you can do given the amount of monies that are coming in, you can use them to put your budget together. But the thing is, I would be prepared to explain why you have this certain operating reserve, or if you have this certain plan that's using this ratio. What's more important to me is that you know exactly what it costs to provide a service that you are doing, and you can explain that. So if you say, we're going to have an after-school program, we know that if we serve 200 kids, it's going to cost this much based on what we plan. So we have to raise this much in order to keep it going. That's the kind of information that a funder is going to want to know. Beyond that, for your own budgeting purposes and your own planning purposes, you can get to a level of complexity that goes beyond it, and you can use whatever you need to do your budgeting effectively. But a funder is going to, in a certain way, use the simple idea is that this project, you're asking me for $50,000 for this project that costs $50,000, or you're asking me for whatever for this project that costs $50,000, and it's going to serve 25 kids. They're going to do that kind of simple mathematics. $50,000 divided into 25 kids costs what? So that's 25 kids, $2,000 a kid. That is the very simple kind of math that comes out of this when you're analyzing this to see whether it's a good investment. So that's a long way of saying that the planning that you do, it's less important for your internally. If you've been used to doing it this way and have set ratios that you use, that's fine. But the important thing to a funder is, I want to see exactly what your expenses are going to be, and I want to see that the investment of my money is going to go the right way. And they're thinking, comparing not with standardized ratios, but with the costs of this program and that program. They're looking at programs and weighing them against each other. Does this answer your question well enough? Is it getting to what you were thinking about? Lost Robert.
One more question from Lee.
Sure.
She's wondering about budgeting with projections.
Yes. So for the future, and it's a good time to talk about that because we are in the midst of a situation where you have to project what you're going to do. Did she have any other question related to projections?
It just says, what about budgeting with projections?
Yeah, you were going to have a projection for a particular situation. So one contingency that I would do for doing a budget right now is, let's assume that everything stays the way it is right now. What is your budget for next year, given that you are still using the virtual methods of delivering that you have always, or you have done since the COVID crisis? But I would also put a contingency budget together that would show how it might vary depending on the change of situation. Nobody did that at the beginning of 2020 because nobody knew that this was coming the way that it did. However, now that you're in the middle of something which is an odd situation, you definitely want to be prepared to share one budget that pretty much says this is what we're estimating based on our best knowledge or best guess, but also potentially a contingency budget that accounts for changes in your circumstance, meaning COVID vaccine, meaning continued COVID problems. I don't even want to say it, through 2022, that kind of situation. Does that help? Okay. So for some of you, those questions were kind of elevated. For some of you, that was exactly what you needed to hear. So hopefully that helped out. I should say, like I always try to say at the beginning of any program, that I'm not a lawyer and I'm not an accountant. So don't swear on everything that I tell you about like how to handle your finances or anything like that, because I'm not a legal person to do that. However, I only look at it from the point of view of what a funder is going to do. And they are going to look at a situation and they're going to weigh it pretty heavily. And lately, they have been looking very clearly at your situation in this crisis. And they may like entertain more expenses and more odd expenses in this situation, just simply because it's all very new to them and it's all very new to us, all of us. The thing to do is to put together a budget that can work, that explains, your situation now, and be prepared to discuss contingencies. This figure and budget narrative is a way to ensure that your contingencies are looked at. This figure may increase given the continued COVID crisis. This figure is expected to stay the same through 2021. Funders a lot of the time will be very reasonable when you explain something to them, but they want you to make an effort at estimating the cost. So I wish I could say exactly what our training budget is going to be for next year, but it's very dependent on whether we're going to do it in-house or out of house. However, we've made a decision to do most of the things virtually, so I'm going to use that budget as my main budget with some potential contingencies. Okay, I'm going to come out of that and talk about indirect costs. How many people know what indirect costs are? I normally ask you to raise your hand, but we've got a lot of people who don't have their cameras on. So, indirect costs. Indirect costs are also known as administrative costs, overhead costs, supportive services, operating costs. Indirect costs are the costs that are hidden. for an organization. You have a budget for a particular project and it has these expenses. You have to pay for these people. You have to pay for this material. But in addition to that, you have to pay the hidden costs of running an organization. So the visible costs are the direct costs, what we just talked about in putting that budget together. The hidden costs are the indirect costs, the rents and utilities, the telephone and the internet for the whole organization. If you can imagine a phrase next to each one of these bullet points, imagine the phrase for the organization next to them. Rent and utilities for the organization, telephone and internet for the organization, office supplies for the organization, and fundraising. Fundraising is a support services or an indirect cost. So you don't put your grant writer as an expense, as a direct expense for your project. This is overhead. And the thing about overhead is that it can look and can be very big below the surface. It can be something that you don't know how deep it goes. And different organizations have different levels of overhead. Let me show you a calculation. Indirect cost rate or overhead rate is simply finding out what your direct program costs are. And by the way, this is not something that should be a mystery to at least your finance person. Because if you file a 990 with the IRS, you have to know what your total direct costs are, because you have to report direct costs, supporting services, and fundraising using the 990. The direct costs are one column of that, and they're everything that you spend that are direct program costs. And that includes personnel and non-personnel for any program. So for our example, the direct program costs for this organization's youth leadership program are $200,000. Their direct program costs for their college prep program are $300,000. So their total program costs, the total direct service costs, is $500,000. But at the same time, they're spending $100,000 on utilities and on photocopier paper and on fundraising for your organization and the administrative staff that work in human resources. All of that adds up to $100,000. So the indirect cost rate of this organization is indirect cost divided into total direct costs, or 20%. Every organization is going to be different. And that's why when we talk about people looking at your finances, one of the things they look at, and you hear this right around this time of year, where does your charity dollar go? Where does the charity dollar go? If you give to this particular charity, you know, whatever it is, 50 cents out of every dollar goes to fundraising. How do they know that? Well, they know it because it's a public document, because it comes from the 990 that the organization files with the IRS. It's public for your organization too. Is there a right percentage? No, there isn't a right percentage, because total indirect costs for a multi-bed residential care facility are probably going to be a lot higher than total indirect costs for somebody who runs a website, because there's a lot more expenses in addition to simply program focused expenses. What you, and there are different places that give you advice on what yours should be. Charity Navigator and Wise Giving from the Better Business Bureau will say, you know, when it starts to go over 30, 35%, that's worrisome. You should know what your indirect cost rate is, because you should be asking for a percentage of it every time you put your budget together. So in addition to direct costs, everything that you need to directly spend on the project, you should have a percentage, your indirect costs, as part of that budget. So going back here and looking at this budget form, so you have personnel and non-personnel, that all adds up. So there's the personnel, there's the non-personnel, that all adds up to one number. But then if your indirect cost rate is another 20%, you want to add 20% onto that, and that's your real total cost to your program, because it takes into account the fact that from each of your programs, you're going to need to pay for some of your overhead, some of your support services. Do all funders pay for that? No, they don't. I wish they did, but they don't. All funders don't like to pay for that. Does that mean you don't have that expense? No, you still have to pay for support services if you have a need for overhead costs, which every organization does. So you can say to a funder when you write a grant proposal that you are asking for $10,000, and you can tell them none of those funds are going to be used for overhead. You will find funders that don't pay for overhead. You will find funders that don't pay for computers. You will find funders that don't want to pay for personnel. Funders have a way of saying we can give to these kind of expenses, but not others. Government funders are particularly notable for that. Does that mean you don't have those expenses? No. But when you ask them for money, you have to make sure that you clearly say that you're not going to use their funds to pay for something that they do not pay for. I wouldn't pigeonhole yourself otherwise. In general, you want a funder to give to support your program without saying, oh, it's going to buy this computer and this person's salary and this, that. You want to say it's supporting the program. But if a funder doesn't want to pay for a certain part of your program, you want to make sure that you let them know that you're not going to spend the money the way they don't want it to be spent. And the way they know this is because you've detailed it. When you put your indirect costs and you say it's 20% and that's $20,000 or whatever it is, a little bit of budget narrative explaining what it is. This is for a percentage of the organization's operating costs. It would be enough for me to know that this was overhead and what it was for. All of this together, isn't it budgeting fun? I know late afternoon, it's a nasty thing to do to you guys, but budgeting is vital for making sure that you can tell your story clearly. And I do want to make sure that you do take a look at this budget planning form. I'm going to stop sharing my screen right now. Thank you for your chat and additional information, but I'm going to bring up the budget planning form. This is a form that I'm going to ask Hannah to put in to the download. It is a worksheet that we want to make sure that you have a little bit of time to work on. So I'm going to ask to have everybody take some time. I think we'll do another 10 minutes. And I want you to download this form and just work on this for one of your programs. I think it's a good time to do
Dave,
it now.
There is a clarifying question from the
Sure.
previous section about indirect costs.
Yes, please.
Kathy is wondering, just to clarify, your indirect costs are the organization's overhead costs, where you determine the percentage of this overhead as part of the program's cost.
You determine a percentage, your overhead costs are a percentage of the overall expenses for the organization. So if your overall budget is $1 million and you spend $100,000 on overhead, your overhead rate is 10%. You would use that number to create that in a program budget. So your overall budget's $1 million, your program budget, you got it, Kathy? Okay, that's good. But yeah, your overall budget is $1 million, your program budget is $100,000, and your overhead rate is 10%. Your overhead costs for the program is $10,000. I think I did all that math correctly in my head. So hopefully that clarifies for everybody. Any other questions coming in right now? I can't see the chat, so it's difficult to know.
Not at the moment.
Okay, so project budgets. This is a worksheet that I want to see if you guys can download. And you don't have to fill it all out completely right now, but I want you to take a stab at some of this. You can list for your project or the project that you're thinking about, the employees who are going to work on the project. Think about all the direct costs that might be incurred and the income that you are looking to get from it. And if you want, take a time to flip onto the second side of this page and begin to pencil in expenses and income. I'll talk a little bit more about income in just a bit, but I want to just give you guys a chance to sort of take a break from all this heavy duty thinking and to go in and take a little bit of a worksheet time on this. So let's give you guys 10 minutes. So it's 3:25. I'm going to ask everybody to take 10 minutes and to come back at 3:35. If you're not sure about what project, if you have a number of projects that you're thinking about, or you don't have your numbers right in front of you, make some notes on the first page of the program to make sure that you have a clear sense. And remember, how many people served by the program is vital. As I said earlier, one of the things a funder will do is take that budget you're asking for and divide out how many people are you planning to serve. And they know how much per person this program is costing. And they definitely will do that as a one way of evaluating its effectiveness. So take 10 minutes and we'll see questions. We'll come back at 3:35. We have another minute more. I just dropped a sample budget handout into the chat if you want to download that once you're done. But welcome back, everybody. Hopefully you were able to get a little bit of time to get a sense of your budget. I decided to add another handout to this because I wanted to show you a completed budget before we moved on. Had a lot of great complicated questions, complicated in a good way, complex questions. So I wanted to make sure that we had a good answer for you. And I like to share this particular handout because it has a great example of a typical budget. And this is the handout that is in your chat. This is page 2 of that handout. Page 1 has some of the stuff we've already been talking about. And then on page 2, it has a budget and some terminology that we've been using. But the second page here also has a sample budget. And I'll talk about income in just a bit, but I wanted to show you expenses. So we've talked about how you can populate this with clear senses of who's working on the project and how much time. This middle part, as I mentioned, is the essence of budget narrative. It tells you how much time each person is working on the project. There's a line there for the fringe benefit rate. And in this case, the organization has a fringe benefit rate of 11%. And the personnel total, which is 84,360. That's all the personnel direct costs. The non-personnel costs listed here are the consultants mentioned. And what are those consultants? It's a social worker, 2 of them at $23.07 an hour, 4 hours, 36. Oh, I'm sorry. The program evaluation is a consultant, $11,000. The social worker is $30,000. Those are 2 consultants paid a salary. The volunteers, tutors, are paid, 2 of them at $23.07 an hour for 4 hours for 36 weeks. And you see exactly the costs there. Anytime there's anything else that's being used, program equipment, it doesn't just say program equipment, it has a description, a budget narrative in the middle that describes it. So we have a total personnel cost and we have a total non-personnel cost. That adds up to $165,254. The indirect cost rate for this particular budget, for this particular organization, is 20%, $33,051, which is 20% of $165,254. So the real total cost of this particular budget is $198,305. I might even add a little bit of a description, a footnote or something next to this indirect cost rate to indicate what this went towards. It went towards fundraising costs and human resources costs and rent and office supplies and whatever else is the office costs. But I think this is a nice, short, easy way to put in both the budget costs and the budget narrative. Did anybody else have any questions? I'm going to stop sharing this for a second. Any questions related to this? We have one from Asha. Asha is saying, will the grant proposal detail the funded expense line items, or you do give the entire budget and the funder subtracts what is not funded? That's a great question. One thing that you can do, and some funders will actually ask you to use their budget and it will have this, is a column that says whether or not you've got the money to pay for these things already. A column that just says pending or committed. I tend to not include that. I tend to say, in the expense listing, like what we just looked at, that should be the real total costs, and it should not indicate anywhere on there whether or not you've received the money yet. It just simply says, these are the things we need to pay for this project. However, I do encourage you to share information like how much money you have on hand in the income section, and that's what I'm going to talk about next. So please do keep sharing your questions. I'm going to go through this last part of the budget here. So I'm going back to the original slideshow. Showing your income is the other part of the budget. You may have already started to work on that in your worksheet, but I wanted to talk about it because most people, when they're thinking about sharing income, they may not know what the best way to do that is. They may think, well, you know, I'm not sure what, they may not sure which way to do it. You know, I asked 7 foundations for money. Should I list them all? Well, there are a couple of different ways to do it. The way that I'm going to suggest doing it is simply this way. Do it by category. When you have a budget, say it adds up to $1 million, your total income should also add up to $1 million. So expenses and income should add up to the same amount. You can divide out your grants and contributions and earned income into different categories, which gives the funder an idea of where the money is coming from and how diverse your funding sources are. It's important to a funder a lot of the time that you're not relying solely on foundations or solely on one source of funding, because if that funding source dries up, it's gone. Government funding at 99% is fantastic if you can get it, but if you can't keep it, it's a problem. So you want to show your income by category. And what I just said to Asha is that you could add another column on here. I'm not going to draw it in, but it would be in this next column over, and it would say pending or committed. And it would simply say how much of the money, say you had to get $10,000 from the government, how much of that money in the pending or committed column has already been received. That tells the funder 2 things. It tells you that you've already gotten some money committed, which is always a very positive thing for a funder to see. And it shows that you're not just striking out everywhere but in one place. It's an optional kind of thing. I wish I could say that there's one way to do a budget, but there are millions of ways to do a budget. I'm trying to do it as simply as possible, and the simplest way is to do it by category when you show income. Earned income, you have different events, and that event, for example, you might expect to raise $5,000 from an event, and you could put next to that in a budget narrative type way, pending or dependent on March 2nd fundraiser or whatever would help illustrate where this money is coming from. But one thing that you will see in this is that in addition to the expected types of income, there's also in-kind support. In-kind support is important to document. And I'm going to go back to our original budget that I showed you just a minute ago and show you how that can be added. But in-kind contributions are vital to make sure that you're showing the real donations of everything that's necessary to run the project. You can do it just based on reporting what cash you've gotten, and that's fine. If you do it, you can list all the different cash. But say somebody donates the space for a project. How do you put that in a budget? Say somebody donates their time. How do you put that in a budget? It varies depending on what it is. So I'm going to go back to the example budget again and share that with you. So let's talk about income here. Here's income based on the different categories. So you're getting 37,000 from foundations, corporations 16,000, individuals 45,717. It tells me exactly what amounts are expected or committed from the different areas. It also tells you where in-kind support comes from. Do you remember when we looked at this budget and we looked at the expenses and we looked at the volunteers? Did anybody say to themselves, why are you paying volunteers money when they don't get paid? Well, they don't get paid. They're volunteer tutors, but they have a value. And this is what is known as the value of volunteer time. And I'm hoping that Hannah is sharing that with you right now. An organization called the Independent Sector calculates the value of volunteer time. And it is one way that you can represent how much value a volunteer has. The value of volunteer time is somewhere around $23 an hour. It might be even more now since we created this sample budget. But this doesn't mean that you pay these volunteers $6,644. It means that they have a value based on the amount that they work of that amount. So it's listed as an expense because if you didn't get it donated, which you do, and you document it the same way with the same amount in the income section, you didn't get it donated, you'd have to list it as an expense that you would have to pay. But as it is, you're getting it donated as in-kind support. Similarly, the program space is donated, $13,000 value. But it also shows down here as the program space cost, $13,000. Well, you don't have to pay for it, but if you didn't get it donated, you would. Your expenses always list everything that you would have to pay for, no matter whether you got it donated, no matter whether you have the money for it at the moment. It should be everything you would need to pay for to run the program. The in-kind is folded into the income as well as folded into the expenses. I hope that's clear from this example. All right, I'm going to stop sharing again, and I see we have a couple of more links here. Oh yes, that's calculating the value of volunteer time. And it, by the way, varies depending on regions. You can use Independent Sector's website to find out what it should be for your region. You also don't have to use that value when you're estimating the value of something. Somebody's donating marketing costs. You don't like calculate it as, oh, they're donating a marketing staff person. You can actually represent what those costs are, like the rent. The rent is $13,000. That's what you would pay if you didn't get it donated. That's what it costs. Similarly, for people other than sort of everyday volunteers, like lawyer donating their time, they're making more than $23 an hour. They're making considerably more than that. So you would want to calculate what you would have to pay them if they didn't donate their time. You want to try and give the most accurate representation of your budget in this project. And as you can see from the amount of time that we're spending and some of the questions, it is complex, but it is not impossible. And funders expect that you're going to have questions. The important thing to do when you're filling out a funder's budget is to make sure that you ask if you don't know the answer to a particular question. You can ask me, what do they mean by that on this budget form that they're using? But I'm going to be guessing just like you are. The best thing to do if you have a form from a funder and you have a question about how it's to be completed is to ask them. Similarly, all of these different things, audited financial statements, organization-wide budgets, they often ask for all of these different things. If you can't supply them and they ask for it, talk to them to find out what you can send them instead. Okay. I always created and maintain a document drawer or a large file on my desktop so I wouldn't lose anything. Budget isn't just a budget, just like the grant proposal isn't just a proposal. If it's accepted and you have it funded, you are going to be responsible for adhering to what you said you were going to do. Remember that if you need to make a major change, a major variance, say you asked for $40,000 and half of that was going to go for computers. And after you got the $40,000, you got all those computers donated. and you didn't spend the money on the computers. You can't just then say, ooh, I win, I can spend $20,000 on whatever. You should go back to the funder and say, we requested money specifically for the cost of computers, or among other things, the cost of computers. And we don't need to use them for computers, but we have an idea that's in keeping with this grant. Generally, funders don't want money back. But if you are going to spend it in a way different than they expect, remember that you usually have to report the actual cost versus the projected cost. You usually have to report back, how did you use our money? So don't use it in a way that they don't know about, because you will have to explain that. And in the case with grant makers, it's much easier to get permission than it is sometimes to get forgiveness. If they think of you as somebody who misuses money and doesn't tell them, that's going to hurt your future in trying to get money from them. So remember to know your project thoroughly and estimate direct costs. Include a percentage for indirect costs and make sure you're clear about where the income is coming from. I'll pause here again for more questions. And hopefully you have the last link there that Hannah has shared with you. It is the link to the sample documents at Candid. Yes, exactly.
There was a question from Robert. He wanted some clarification on determining personnel cost as direct or indirect.
Yeah, sure. So can you clarify that? Oh, I'm not clear. How do you decide if a personnel cost is direct or indirect? Certainly, I can clarify that. The simple way is does that person work for your organization? The IRS actually is very clear about defining who's an employee and who's a consultant. If your organization is not clear about that, the IRS's rules on their website and a lot of their documentation will tell you how that decision is made. But for the most part, you know when somebody's been hired for your organization and when you're just paying them to do the work. Personnel, when we talk about personnel, it's somebody that works for your organization. That personnel cost is direct only if they are working directly on your project. So let's take somebody like your executive director. Executive director works for your organization, their personnel. Okay, that's great. They get a certain salary, $100,000 a year, whatever it is. That's great. But they only work 10% of their time on your project. So that personnel cost for that project, they could only get 10% of their salary from it. So 10% of 100,000 is 10,000. Maybe they also do administrative duties that have nothing to do with any projects. Maybe they spend 40% or 50% of their time during administrative duties. So some of their money may come from indirect costs as well. It all depends on what work the person is doing. If it's work directly related to a project, it's a direct cost. If it's work not related to the project, but work for the whole organization, it's indirect. Hopefully that clarifies it. I'm getting some strange clanking sounds. I don't know if that's somebody muted or somebody needs to mute. I hope it's not me. It's getting late in the afternoon, so I may be making clanking sounds.
I did, in addition to the other links, Dave put in a link to a Candid Learning page that has specific budget information and examples. So
great.
Might help some
Thank
people
you so much.
answer some of those more
budgets
general
are
questions.
not fun for, particularly if you don't work with them regularly. But again, always asking the funder. And that's my last part of this presentation, is really talking about making that connection. It's not a mail order kind of situation or a cash machine. You're not going to a funder to get funding for your organization and treating it as if it's an impersonal exchange. Most of the time, you've done research on these funders and you've made a phone call before you even make connection to them. In the guidelines that we have on the Foundation Directory Online, the funders list who they are giving to, they list how to contact them, and they encourage you to make an initial approach. And that initial approach varies. It can be a letter of inquiry, a short version of your grant proposal, can be an email, can be a phone call. whatever it is, I generally say, look to see if there's a phone number and make a phone call first. Because you can do all the research you can and be incredibly good at it, but you may find information about this foundation the day after it decides to completely change what it's doing. If you call them and talk to them, it's not always a possibility because they don't all have staff. But if they do have a phone number and they do have staff, I encourage anyone before they apply to any foundation to make a phone call and say, you know, I'd like to talk to somebody about my project. I understand from my research that you were really interested in education or interested in hunger or interested in the youth in Toledo, whatever it is, and say, I'd like to submit a grant proposal for this project. I think it's a great match for you. And you want to find out from them if they're interested. That way, you can build a relationship. And that relationship continues. After you submit a grant proposal, you are continually trying to check in with a funder, trying to make sure that they have gotten what they need. They may even do a site visit. They may come to you and say, you know, I want to find out more about your organization. If you're a new organization in particular, they may arrange for a site visit or a way to talk to you virtually so that they can get the information that they need. And they make that decision not just based on what you send them, though that's the bulk of it. They do it based on the additional information, their due diligence that they do with what you send them. And then they make a decision, and that decision can be yes or no. If the answer is yes after you submit a grant proposal, that's the beginning of a relationship, and you need to keep the funder well informed of what's going on, which means you don't treat it as if you just cash that check and you don't think about them again until the next time you need money. You're responsive to them. First of all, you follow the guidelines. As I said, if the budget changes, you need to let them know. If your program changes, if it's radically different, if it's going in a different direction, if it needs to be delayed, which in the latest situation, it definitely needs to be delayed, then you can let them know that and tell them this needs to be delayed because of COVID situation. We cannot meet with them, meet with the people that we need to meet with. We need to make sure that we have a method of handling this situation. Always keep in communication with the funder. It's always a great idea when you see changes like this coming down to be proactive. Oh, your executive director is leaving. That's not something you want to find out later on. All of the funders that you have a connection with need to know when your executive director leaves. Similarly, if you're not going to do what you said you were going to do, or it's going to change, let them know. The other thing that you want to do is be convinced and be clear that if you don't get the grant, that doesn't mean it's the end of the relationship. If you've made an effort to research a funder and you found out that they're a good connection, a good possibility, you see the fit, you've explained it to them in the grant proposal, you called them, you sent a grant proposal in, you went through the whole process. If they say no, that isn't necessarily the end of the relationship. Remember that this is not a personal kind of thing. These funders are working with money that they are managing. They need to, as part of their job, give that money away. So they are not deciding to be weird about it and not giving you money just because they don't feel like it. It's based on something that has to do with how well you fit with them. So I encourage people to build that relationship further, even if the answer is no. You can always find out why, or you can often find out why, I should say. Some funders, as I said, they don't have phones, they don't have ways of getting a hold of them. They send you a letter and that's the end of the story. But if they give you a way of making a connection, calm down after you hear this no, and then find out why they said no, so you can reach out to them. In that call, in that attempt to reach out and find out if they're interested, ask about future funding. Ask about how they're changing. I know that in the COVID situation that we're currently in, there are many organizations that took a look at their giving and have changed a little bit on how it works. They may have dedicated more funds to giving specifically for basic needs or for COVID-related needs. You may find yourself with a foundation that has changed some of their priorities based on racial equity thought and some of the things that have come out from that. They may have added additional funds or dedicated funding in a different direction than they had in the past. Find out why they said no this time. Find out whether they're going to say no in the future, because you don't want to waste your time going to a funder that's not going to fund you in the future. Move on from where you are and seek other prospects, because there's no point in trying to force them to change their mind or trying to say, well, you know, you're understanding it wrong. They're not understanding it wrong. They're understanding it the way their organization understands it. The key takeaways for any of this is to make sure that when you write a grant proposal, you're keeping your language very clear, very concise. You're focusing on the interests of the funders and what they care most about. You are seeing that from your research and using Foundation Directory to find out what are the funders that I'm interested in, what do they care about? And you're following those guidelines. I didn't go belabor that point, but honestly, if you have a grant maker that says, you know, our narrative needs to be 2 pages long and no longer, or the paragraphs need to be with 1-inch margins, I've actually seen this, or their online form says 357 characters or 350 characters, don't ignore that. You don't want to give them an easy reason to say no. Revise and edit before submitting. I know that I've had trouble with Excel spreadsheets that don't seem to add up right, and I've had trouble with spelling people's names wrong. I've had trouble where I thought I spell checked it and it seems to have used the last version. Get somebody else to read it who will tell you when your tired eyes have missed something, and they will tell you when something isn't understandable. We do regular workshops on this, and we do regular workshops on other things related to this. I mentioned one of them already. If you're working on putting together your programs and you're working on understanding how outcomes works, and you want a lesson on logic models, building a process from all the inputs that you put into all the outputs and the outcomes that you're getting from your program. We have a virtual workshop coming up in January on the 12th, Outcomes Thinking and Management. It's a great 3-hour workshop. It's really in depth. And I hope me and a number of my other staff are working on teaching these. We're also doing one that is specifically focused on working with your board and doing fundraising with your board members. That's happening on January 26th. I know it's hard to think of the new year. It's hard for me to believe it's December, but if you were thinking about programs for the new year, here are a couple of links for those. That's what I have for you guys today. I know it's a little after 4. I'm around and I'm here to answer questions, but I wanted to make sure that you guys get everything that you need. So I'm going to pause right now and see if there are any questions that have come out directly from anybody here. So stop sharing. We have Heather has shared a fantastic article in here called A Graphic Revisioning of Nonprofit Overhead. Workshop leader Kurt Klotz on page 6 of the Center for Nonprofit Resources publication. Particularly if you have issues with overhead and understanding it in budgets, that's a great resource. Thanks so much, Heather, for sharing that. Hannah, do you have any other questions or anything else coming in? Thank you so much for.
I'm not sure if she put that in the chat directly to you, Dave, but the rest of the group doesn't have that.
Sorry, I'll fix that.
I'm going to share it because I think it's terrific.
You do it, or do you want me to do it?
I'll do it. I'll just put it in here.
Who can do it faster? Quick, quick, quick. Let's
Oh,
find
no.
it.
There we go. Yeah, that's not just that's for all of us. So I know that overhead is a challenging idea, so it's great to have this resource. Any questions from anybody else or any concerns? Zach, what about you? Do you have any concerns?
Concerns? Never. But I do encourage people, if they have any last minute questions, to put them in. And I want to say thank you, Dave and Hannah and Heather, for a great program. And I know it's close to the holidays, so I thank everyone who stuck through for a 3-hour program. And that can be kind of hard when your brain's on.
I feel like I should be giving you a medal, or I'll just give you some applause here. Thank
And
you.
of course, there's so much more to learn out there. I think grant writing is certainly a process that takes time. So as things come up for you in this process, know that we're here at the library. The Candid has some amazing resources that I always share with everybody. But we have an entire book collection on helping you to get where you need to be. And we talked about Foundation Directory Online. And if you're interested in learning on how to use that, here's my direct contact information as well.
I'm putting my contact in there as well. So if you need to email me about anything I talked about, please do. And looking forward to, I hope that you guys will connect with Zach if you haven't, connect with Heather if you haven't. And if there's no other questions, I think we'll just say that's it.